Hello everybody, and welcome to our webinar on the literature-based assessment of the EU ETS. Today, it's a real pleasure for us to present our report that has been the object of 2 years and a half of research here at FSR Climate. The research has been conducted by several researchers through these years. And so, first of all, I would like to thank my predecessors as director of FSR Climate, Xavier Lavandeira, and also some of the team members, Jordi Texido and Claudio Marcantonini, who were here before I arrived. But I would also like to take the opportunity to thank my team members, Isabella Luisio, Francesco Nicoli, Tong Tzu, and here next to me, Stefano Verde. Stefano is next to me because I asked him to present today in the webinar. Stefano has always been here, so he's a kind of bridge between past and present. And it's a great opportunity to listen to his presentation on all 6 chapters of the ETS assessment report. So I asked Stefano to give the presentation. He'll take a little break in between, let's say after the 3rd chapter, and so to see, I will collect clarification questions, if there is any, and then we'll proceed and to the end of the assessment report, and then we will have some time for questions. So, Stefano, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Simone, and thank you everyone for being here. I am pleased to present the results of our assessment of the EU emission trading system. And as you will see, I will have to cruise over several different topics and issues. So you understand that it's not possible to go into the very details in all cases, but there will be some time at the end of the presentation to receive some questions that you may have. And as Simone said, midway through the presentation, I will pause and see whether there are questions from you, mainly clarifications, questions about clarifications about what I've said. So the purpose of this webinar is to describe the literature that we have looked at, its findings, and the limitations of this literature. All right. So the report has 6 chapters, and the presentation follows the order of the chapters. The first one is on free allowance allocation, then competitiveness effects and carbon leakage, interactions with other policies, low carbon innovation and investment, the international dimension of the ETS, and finally, a multi-criteria evaluation of the ETS as a whole. On the topic of free allowance allocation, we have considered 2 distinct bodies of literature. One comprising empirical studies that assess the rules for free allocation. The other one, the studies that provide empirical estimates of pass-through rates of carbon costs by regulated firms or sectors. Concerning the first body of literature, the different studies have been sorted by topic, and the topic are those that you see there. So one is concerns the rules, the rule applied in the ETS to identify the sectors at risk of carbon leakage. The second topic concerns the rules for benchmarking, and specifically how they affect allowance allocation with respect to efficiency, allocative efficiency. Then there are studies, and there are 3 studies that we found that test econometrically for the presence of an endowment effect, or more generally for the independence property. Now, just a word to say what an endowment effect is, or the independence property, rather, more in general, is about. Basically, the independence property states that it makes no difference whether allowances are distributed for free or through or not, typically through auctions. That makes no difference on operational decisions, so on output and emissions of regulated agents. Then the fourth topic is about activity level thresholds applied in the ETS as of phase 3 and closure provisions that were ubiquitous in the, especially in phase 2. Phase 1 and phase 2. The second body of literature, so those studies that provide estimates of cost pass-through rates, are classified by basically sector, whether they provide estimates for the electricity sector, which is something kind of on its own, and then studies that look at the manufacturing sectors. So, what is the evidence, the robust evidence emerging from this literature? Concerning the studies that look at the rules of free allocation, well, certainly there's a consensus on the fact that phase 3 represents a major improvement. The rules introduced as of phase 3 brought in a major improvement of allowance allocation with respect to allocative efficiency. And that has been the result of mainly two factors. One, the fact that allocation rules have been harmonized at EU level. And secondly, the introduction of benchmarking. There is also, on the other hand, quite a consensus on the fact that the rule that is used to identify the sectors at risk of carbon leakage is too lenient, which means that it's the opposite of stringent. So too many sectors in the end up being classified as at risk of carbon leakage and therefore, as such, receiving more free allowances. And that's mainly for two reasons. One, because at the beginning of phase 3, a carbon price assumption was used of 30 euros per ton of CO2, and as we know, that was disproved by how the price of carbon evolved during phase 3. And secondly, the consideration of trade intensity, sectoral trade intensity on its own, being only a very approximate measure of risk. So basically, there could be highly trade-intensive sectors that end up being considered at risk of carbon leakage, but maybe they are not very intensive in terms of carbon. So their actual exposure to risk of carbon leakage is not significant. Concerning benchmarking, there's quite a large agreement on the fact that benchmarking has greatly contributed to improving allocation with respect to allocative efficiency. There's a study that shows that benchmarking per se on its own reduced the number of allowances by 20% compared to the previous trading periods, while guaranteeing still sufficient safeguard with respect to carbon leakage risk. On the other hand, there's also one study that shows that the benchmarking system is not perfect, especially for those sectors where there are particularly heterogeneous, either in structure or in or across countries, especially. So there's one case, there's one study that shows how in Sweden the paper sector has received more free allowances in phase 3 than in the previous two periods because EU-wide harmonized rules were applied, but the paper sector in Sweden has a special energy mix. So this is just to say that the benchmarking system has been really beneficial for allocative efficiency, but is not exempt for some imperfections. Concerning the question of the endowment effect or the independence property, the studies that look at the electricity sector don't find evidence of a violation of these independence property, but we concluded that based on other studies that look also at manufacturing sectors, that a violation of the independence property is more likely to be observed for manufacturing sectors, and that's for two reasons basically. One, that manufacturing companies may be less attuned than utilities in trading, and the second one is that manufacturing companies, especially those that are trade exposed, maybe some may prefer to maximize market shares as opposed to profits. So instead of passing through the opportunity cost of free allowances, some firms may prefer to not to increase their output prices. But then this would lead to a violation of the independence property. Concerning the studies looking at the ex post adjustments to allocations after major changes in output, there's basically evidence that firms do respond strategically to these thresholds, activity level thresholds. So there's one study that shows that for the cement sector, production of cement increased as a result of these threshold that so basically companies, in order to avoid a major reduction in their allowances, produce more just enough to avoid this application of the threshold. And there's also another study that shows that closure provisions likely delayed installation exits. Closure provisions basically is referred to the rule that if you close the plant, you are not going to receive the allowances, the future allowances, the allowances that you still have to receive in following years and that were already allocated to you. So you forego these the right to these allowances. Well, this has the unintended effect of delaying exit of already non-economic installations. As concerned the second body of literature I mentioned before, that is the studies that provide econometric estimates of cost pass-through rates for different sectors. For the electricity sector, there's high pass-through rates are generally found, and this as expected. And that's because the electricity sector, we know, is not exposed or little exposed to international competition, virtually not exposed to international competition, and demand elasticity of demand for electricity is very low. So high pass-through rates in the electricity sector are to be expected. Nevertheless, there's some variation, some significant variation across countries related to differences in energy mix, the level of market concentration, and the level of spare production capacity. The story is different entirely for manufacturing products, for which pass-through rates are, first of all, very different, generally difficult to estimate. That's mainly because of a lack of suitable data. Manufacturing products have many different inputs, and certainly more than electricity as a product, and so it's more challenging to have information on the prices of all these inputs, and this is the main obstacle to estimation of pass-through rates for manufacturing products. Nevertheless, there are studies that provide estimates there, and there's basically the main point is that there's large variation in the level of pass-through rates across manufacturing sectors, and this is explained by product and location-specific characteristics of the markets. So specific demand and supply factors are crucial in determining these results. So it's really these are really results that are sector-specific and even country-specific. There's variation across countries. That is important. We concluded that this difficulty of accurately quantifying difference in cost pass-through ability of regulated firms is probably the main hindrance, obstacle to further improvements of free allocation with respect to in terms of efficiency. So this is the main challenge probably that remains for the regulator, and well, for researchers first, and then for the regulator when it's called to design legislation. And yeah, so it's also a suggestion for researchers who want to contribute. This is a topic of interest, certainly for policy reasons. Moving to the second chapter, so a chapter in which we basically surveyed the econometric literature that tests for the presence of competitiveness effects of the EU ETS and carbon leakage. This is a literature that is pretty wide and growing. We found 33 studies, although only 2 directly test for carbon leakage, which here I mean carbon leakage. In order to test for carbon leakage, you also need to test that emissions have actually increased outside Europe as a result of the EU ETS. So there are only 2 studies that actually test for this, for increase in emissions abroad, overseas. All the others test for competitiveness effects only. Within this literature, we have distinguished between two bodies. One comprising the studies estimating effects on outcomes linked, different outcomes, economic outcomes linked to competitiveness, so profits measures, exports, sales, employment, productivity measures. And then the studies that instead look at the stock market to infer whether investors believe that the ETS is beneficial or detrimental to profits of regulated firms. So concerning the first body of literature, well, there are a few slides after this one, so I'll keep it to the side for a second. Whereas concerning the second body of literature, so to say the stock market studies, well, basically these studies are pretty homogeneous in terms of approach, methodology. They all use multivariate time series models, and basically they look at the sign of correlation between stock returns and carbon price changes, and they analyze how these correlation, the sign of this correlation, changes across sectors, companies, or trading periods. Trading periods we know is important because free allocation rules have evolved considerably, from phase 1 through phase 3, and then now will be for phase 4. So here these studies we classify them by sector. So for the studies that only focus on the electricity sector, and typically they distinguish between clean versus dirtier generators, or studies that look at multiple sectors. So as I promised to spend a few words on the body of literature that focuses on competitiveness measures, which is the bulk of these of the literature surveyed in this chapter. So here in the first table, you can see how these studies are, well, in this case, it's actually estimates, are sorted by the type of dependent variable, so the measure of the competitive measure that they look at, the type of competitive measure that they look at. And as you can see, the productivity measures is the most commonly used type of competitiveness outcome that is considered. Then you have trade measures, employment measures, profitability measures, turnover, value added, investment, and production costs. In the second table, the same. Here, these are the studies themselves. The same studies are sorted according to two dimensions. One is the type of approach, econometric approach that is used, so time series, panel data, difference in differences, and the dimension of the level of analysis, which can be firm or plant level or sector level. The red circle there highlights the fact that 12 out of 21, so a big proportion of the studies, uses the difference in differences approach, which seems to have become really the workhorse of in terms of the approach, workhorse approach in this literature. The third table sorts the same studies according to following a different logic, basically according to whether the estimated effects are country specific or not, and then the other dimension according to whether the same effects are sector specific or not. So, for instance, if a study provides an estimate for the impact of the ETS on the pulp and paper sector in Sweden, well, that will be a sector-specific and country-specific estimate effect. If instead it's a study that provides an estimate for the pulp and paper sector across Europe, that would be sector-specific, but country-generic. That's how we call it. And again, here the red circle highlights the fact that 12 studies provide sector-specific estimates, and some of these 12 refer to the same sector. So our remark is on the fact that there are in fact not many estimates that are sector-specific, for different. So there are not many sector-specific estimates on which the regulator can rely on to know how the EU ETS has impacted on the competitiveness of the different sectors. So this again could be an invitation to researchers to focus on methodologies and approaches that then result in sector-specific effects, allow to produce sector-specific effects. This slide refers to the same literature and shows how basically it refers to the time coverage of the same literature. As you can see, there are the red bars stretch for the years of the covered by the study. There are only a few studies that stretch as far as the first years of phase 3. So clearly there's a delay with the production of empirical econometric evidence in this literature. So concerning the evidence emerging, what are our conclusions? Well, by far the most frequent conclusion is that no evidence is found of negative effects of firms' competitiveness, and the explanations for these are mainly two: moderate to very low carbon prices and generous free allocation. There are two studies. There are a few studies that find negative effects. Although it's also true that in most cases, these effects are either statistically different from zero only at the 10% level, so there's a more uncertainty than ideal about the significance of these, statistical significance of this effect, or they are accompanied by caveats about data or methodology. There are two studies that perhaps deserve particular attention, and why? Because they find that for Italy and Germany, there are some sectors, especially those that are more exposed to international competition and less capital intensive, intensifying their foreign direct investment activity. So this could be ring a bell about the risk of investment leakage. So this is something that, again, researchers should probably focus on, one of the things to focus on for the future. So the risk of investment leakage as measured by FDI. In general, then there are some studies that find positive effects, but these are usually explained by windfall profits rather than by increased productivity. It's unclear whether the ETS had a sort of a Porter hypothesis type effect that is increasing productivity. So certainly, in many cases, the positive effects are related to windfall profits. And here, the studies, the stock market literature, I think that is particularly good at showing that free allocation plus pass-through opportunity costs resulted in increased profits, windfall profits. So it's particularly effective in that sense. Just three caveats about this literature. One is that most empirical analyses only refer to phase 1 and phase 2. The second is that sector-specific effects are relatively few, as I said before. And third, that yes, most estimated effects refers to short-term effects rather than long-term effects. This time is running quickly. I should move to chapter 3. As you know, ETS is not the only policy in Europe that reduces emissions. There are notably renewable policies and energy efficient policies in place in all European countries, and they are there for good reasons. They address market failures or respond to other policy objectives. It's true that in a static efficiency perspective, these other policies increase the cost of emissions reductions by the EU ETS. But if you take a dynamic efficiency perspective, which is the one suitable for that applies to the long term, well, this is not the same conclusion is not obvious. So we found limited empirical literature relevant to the interactions between the ETS and these other energy policies, and all the each and every of the studies that we found responds to one of the following questions. So one is basically how much abatement was due to these other complementary policies rather than to the EU ETS. Then what was the abatement cost of these complementary policies? And finally, what was the impact of these complementary policies on the carbon price, on the ETS carbon price? Well, so the evidence, well, I followed the order of these of the questions. The first case, so there are unit commitment models and of the electricity system and econometric models that are highly consistent in finding that that these other policies reduced more emissions in absolute terms. They reduced more emissions than significantly more emissions than the EU ETS. However, and here I'm moving to the second question, the cost of abatement is higher. The cost of abatement of these other policies is higher than what it would have likely been for the ETS alone. There's also, this has to be said, large variation, of course, across technologies. You know, if you have wind or solar, and also across countries, solar in Italy, solar in the UK, in Germany, they have implicit different, very significant different costs of abatement. Then concerning the third question, that is the impact of these other policies on the carbon price, there's only one study that takes this question and find that monthly variation in a renewables generation explains only a small proportion of monthly variation in the carbon price. So as you can understand, these are relationship that connects monthly variations only. So it's only these short-term relationships has been tested, whereas how these other policies have impacted on the average carbon price over several years, we don't know that. It has not been estimated as yet. Okay, here now, before moving to talking about the low carbon innovation, I will take a pause and see whether anyone asks for clarifications while I was talking.
To be honest, I don't think so, which means that you were quite clear so far.
I'm surprised.
It's a good surprise. If there is any clarification questions, please just write us. Otherwise, in the meantime, while you take a break, I would like to underline that while I was listening to you, that actually I do realize how the literature grew over the years, because now it's almost 14 years since the beginning of the emission trading system. I remember a work by, I think, Danny and Claudio in the past that was 10 years and counting, right?
Yeah.
So we are counting, and we can tell from this study how much the literature has grown and keeps growing. So it's really interesting how new evidence is emerging on a monthly basis, let's say.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, if there are no questions so far, I think we can go.
Yeah. All right. So, actually, I'm sorry, I have a drink. Okay, this is a very important topic, of course, the impact of ETS on low carbon innovation and investment. Here, investment, we can consider it as adoption. So innovation and adoption of low carbon technologies. The literature is significant in terms of the number of studies. We found 21 studies, but we realized that it fails to offer a full view of the state of things, and mainly for two reasons. One is that there's not a single ex post analysis as yet that comes up to the beginning of phase 3. And secondly, the number of econometric studies is quite small. We found 6 out of 21. So yeah, these are two limitations of the literature. In the first case, well, it's regrettable that there are no studies covering phase 3 because there were important regulatory changes as of phase 3, notably extended auctioning and the introduction of benchmarking, which could have affected low carbon innovation. The second is that, the second here is more a comment on why there are only few econometric studies, and that there's a shortage of suitable and accessible databases to conduct this type of analysis. So, still based on the first two trading periods, there are some conclusions that are quite robust. One is that the ETS has not stimulated a large-scale low-carbon investment, It has mainly simulated small-scale investment with amortization times of 3 to 5 years, to give you an idea, resulting in incremental emission reductions. There is a prominent econometric study, however, that finds that UTS caused a substantial increase in low-carbon patents filed by regulated firms. This is not necessarily in contrast with the previous finding I told you before. So basically, UTS seems to incentivize, to spur incremental emission reductions, but at the same time incentivize innovation as measured through patents. And there's a recent study by Rafael Carrel that seems to that finds the same, confirms this story, and it's a study applied to the UK. In Europe, well, this is not a finding about the UTS itself, but certainly it's relevant. The fact that energy prices have been the main driver of low carbon innovation and investment in Europe, more than the ETS on its own. Another result is that free allocation, it seems that free allocation has hampered low carbon investment. And this relates to the question I mentioned before. Chapter 1 is addressed of the independence property. So it seems that agents are not perfectly neutral to the way they receive the allowances, the way they acquire the allowances. And so, yeah, probably the main explanation here is that firms, some firms at least, fail to recognize the opportunity cost of using free allowances for compliance purposes. Okay, this point I think I can skip over. It's more specific than is quite specific. And finally, the importance of long-term emission reduction targets and the importance of their credibility to trigger investment by virtue of the fact that they reduce regulatory uncertainty. So the literature stresses this aspect. Moving to the fifth chapter that looks at the international dimension. This, as the title of the slides shows, is a different topic, significantly different topic from the previous ones, from previous chapters, for a number of reasons. In the first place, the topic itself is a bit blurred in its definition. So we tried to provide a definition, which is what you see there. Basically, the international dimension on ETS pertains to its capacity, to the capacity of its regulation to produce economic and environmental effects overseas, whether through the linkage with other systems or with other climate policies, or whether this happens, without a linkage, for instance, typically by leading by example, let's say. So the regulation of ETS influences either the emergence of similar systems abroad or the regulation of these other systems abroad. Still, this pertains to the international dimension of the ETS. UTS has in its sense exerted significant influence on the outside world, but there's been few relevant experiences, and therefore there's very limited empirical evidence on which we can rely on. The third reason why this topic is different from the previous is that the context is really important, key to analyze the international dimension of the ETS. And here I basically mainly refer to the international climate change regime. So, the ETS was established under the era of Kyoto. Then it has gone through a phase of high uncertainty concerning the future international climate change regime. And then it recently entered the new, radically different era of the Paris Agreement, with different issues that have arisen. So nevertheless, what are these? There are some experiences, nevertheless, that that we can look at that are relevant. So under the Kyoto Protocol's regime, well, there was the recognition in the ETS of the use of international credits, the CERs generated by the Clean Development Mechanism, and the ERUs generated by the Joint Implementation Mechanism. So the recognition of their use for compliance in the EU ETS. This was an important experience. And then the incorporation of the EFTA countries, namely Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. There was then, a milestone was COP15 in 2009 of Copenhagen. And after that event, the EU proposed to establish an OECD-wide carbon market, but in the end, this idea was not pursued because of developments in the US. Basically, the rejection of the plan of having creating a federal ETS in the ETS. And then there was the failed linking with Australia due to a U-turn of the new Australian government, and the linking with Switzerland, which now it's only waiting for ratification by the parliaments. The Paris Agreement is important for has changed the landscape completely, and specifically for the implications, its implications for the international dimension of the ETS are certainly the following, among others. But that many countries now, not only developed countries, but basically all countries in the world, or virtually all of them, need to implement policies for meeting their commitments. And this just creates many more opportunities for cooperation and possible linkage, eventually linkage. The second thing is that the achievement of the Paris Agreement itself rests on international cooperation mechanism. So basically, there's again a very strong incentive for countries to cooperate, and therefore to look for opportunities to cooperate and perhaps linking their policies. The relevant literature is, as I was saying, given the fact that the experiences are limited, is scant, and it's also concentrated on basically on the topic of international credits. So the topics are the use of the CRs and ERUs by regulated firms, the savings and the profits realized by regulated firms, and also the relationship between the prices of international credits and carbon prices in the ETS. By contrast, the theoretical literature is wide and diverse. So there are the studies that focus on the incentives for international cooperation, and this is the Climate Club's literature. There are studies that instead focus on the outcomes of carbon market integration. So the different ways of linking ETSs could be direct, indirect, one way, double way, restricted or full, and then the benefits and risks of linking. There is then the literature that focuses on the process and the governance of carbon market integration. This is an emerging literature, and that is receiving more and more attention. Perhaps, well, certainly because there is a move in the real world towards international cooperation and the linkage of policies. All right. Finally, the last chapter evaluates the EU ETS as a whole, considering the criteria, the minimum set of criteria that the European Commission recommends for evaluating any European policy, and therefore also the EU ETS. These criteria are the relevance, effectiveness, efficiency, coherence, and EU added value. I will leave to the side for a second the effectiveness and efficiency criteria, and just quickly say that, well, the ETS is relevant because it addresses a societal need, namely decarbonizing the economy. It's arguably coherent with, we think that it's coherent, certainly, well, arguably with respect to the other policies internally, so with respect to renewable energy and energy efficiency policies, and also there's been in that respect a clear improvement with the recent reform of the market stability reserve, and it's fully coherent with the framework of the Paris Agreement. As concerns the added value, to be sure, the EU ETS, the scope of the ETS, the EU-wide scope of the ETS is preferable to the sum of member state equivalent policies, in that they an EU-wide instrument, an EU-wide EU ETS allows for more opportunities allows more opportunities for cheaper emissions abatement. As I said, effectiveness and efficiency. Effectiveness, the criterion of effectiveness responds to the question: does the policy meet its objective? Well, the objective of the ETS, as stated in the directive, is, as you can see on the slide, to promote reductions of greenhouse gas emissions in a cost-effective and economically efficient manner. Now, to reduce emissions, that means environmental effectiveness, and the ETS has reduced emissions. Now here, so it has been effective. So now here, there's a range of estimates that depend on the country that the studies look at and the sectors that are studied and the time of the study. But let's say that the range goes from 2-3% to 15-20% of emissions reductions attributed to the ETS. So certainly the ETS has contributed to emission reductions. Cost effectiveness can be interpreted over the long term or over the short term. Over the long term, well, we think of variables, well, the impact of the ETS on low carbon innovation, and as showed before, there's mixed evidence there. And then on the impact on competitiveness of regulated sectors, and here, well, here the outcome is positive, because there's not significant overall. There's not significant evidence of negative competitiveness effects. If we could look at cost effectiveness in the short-term perspective, well, that leads us to think of, well, the fact that the market has been judged as relatively efficient, and a relatively efficient market, so relatively low, modest transaction costs, quite a liquid market, and not abuse of market power. There's a survey here, especially, that is relevant by Beat Hinterman, that I recommend on this specific question, on the short-term cost effectiveness of the market efficiency of the ETS, which is relevant for the short-term cost effectiveness of the instrument. And then, as I showed, the allocation has improved, allowance allocation has improved significantly with respect to allocative efficiency. Finally, the criterion of efficiency, well, it responds to the questions of whether the policy achieves the highest possible benefit-cost ratio. This would translate into a comparison of the carbon price, EUA price, and the marginal social cost of carbon, that is the marginal benefit of reducing a ton of CO2. Now, there are two reasons for which it's not easy to, maybe it's controversial, this using the marginal social cost of carbon as a measure to judge the efficiency of the ETS, because the marginal cost of carbon itself is is not only very complicated to estimate, but also is to some extent an arbitrary measure. And secondly, even in the logic, it's kind of at odds with the logic of a cap and trade system, that precisely for the reasons that the regulator doesn't know the marginal social cost of carbon, it's preferred to use a quantity instrument, so to cap the amount of emissions and then let the market determine the price. So basically, there's an inherent contradiction in judging the efficiency of the ETS by the marginal social cost of carbon. I mean, it can be done. You can use the marginal social cost of carbon as an indicative measure, but I wouldn't apply it in a strict way. With this, I would stop, and we leave some space for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Stefano. Unfortunately, time is running very fast, but as you saw, there was so much to tell that it was almost unavoidable. I pick up a question that I see on slide 9. In a new scenario with higher prices, do you think it is still foreseeable to find no negative effects on firm competitiveness?
With higher prices, okay. It's true that there are some pressures that are emerging from the price that has gone up, and also the availability of free allocation as a safeguard against competitiveness effects, negative competitiveness effects, that is diminishing in volume. For the mere fact that the cap is declining, and also there's a rule of allocation that whereby the number of allowances is reduced annually. This applies to the sectors not at risk of carbon leakage. But basically, to be short, given that the volume of free allowances is reducing, there are pressures emerging on the competitiveness of regulated firms. With phase 4, we are going to see the part of phase 4 is about a new innovation fund, so a more powerful support to low carbon innovation. So this will be a way to counter pressures on competitiveness, and then we know that there's thinking of the international context, there are more and more countries that are planning or already in the making of new policies, and therefore they result in a narrower gap with the carbon price existing in the EU. So these two forces, I mean, support to low carbon innovation even in the EU, and yes, these international developments help for sure. As I touched upon over in the presentation, there's no evidence, like conclusive evidence, over the Porter hypothesis. So it's also possible that increasing prices, in some cases, at least for some types of firms, may result in increased efficiency of productivity of those firms. There is, on the other hand, evidence of major windfall profits, especially in the first two trading periods. To some extent, less, but probably to some extent still existing in phase 3. So basically, the test, it will be an important test. Yeah, the real test we're gonna see it in the coming years soon. Yeah.
So basically, we will see. There is another question. Maybe I pick it up and very fast response to Tong. And my greetings to Tong, who was asking, will the Paris rulebook have an impact on the EU ETS? In my view, it will certainly have an impact because it's asking for higher ambition in targets from all participant countries. But in a way that's fully in line, in my view, with the EU ETS. The EU ETS was started with this idea, and as we were saying before, there is a strong external coherence between the EU ETS and the Paris Agreement. So I expect they will go hand in hand. So the Paris rulebook will affect the EU ETS, but also probably vice versa in a way.
Yeah, and I think, well, as far as I understand, the Article 6 will be key. Article 6 on cooperative mechanisms, cooperative approaches under the Paris Agreement is key for the EU ETS and in its international dimension. A key aspect in particular is how so-called mitigation outcomes, ITMOs, international tradable mitigation outcomes, will be the accounting basically of these ITMOs, and if it's possible, if it will be possible for two cap and trade systems to link, and then the mitigation outcomes that took place in the other jurisdiction to be accounted towards your NDC, your commitment, I think that will be, and I think it's likely to be, a big boost for the perspective of having clubs based on ETSs, linking together. So yes, Paris Agreement, the rule book, and especially Article 6 will be key.
I think we should close, unfortunately, due to time constraints. But there is an easy question. When will the full report be published online? Stefano, soon. It will be published in early 2019, so beginning of next year. I can't tell you exactly the date yet, but please keep following us online, and you will see very soon the whole report. It's a real pity that we have to close. At least it's a pity for me, because it was a pleasure listening to you. And it's also a strange feeling, because this is the last event of the live side that has accompanied us for quite a long time. And we had several online debates. We had public presentations. I at least recall that one at State of the Union, at the European Parliament, at the World Congress in Gothenburg, and several other events here. I would, listening to you, I would have other questions that comes to my mind. It's too late, I know, but so I promise I don't ask questions now, but simply to say that there are other issues that seem to emerge that, you know, naturally would lead us to ask new questions and look for new answers. But anyway, that will be for the future. For the moment, we stop here. I take this opportunity to thank again the whole team, through Stefano, all the researchers team, also our FSR web team that solved last-minute problems in the backstage, And so really a big thank to all of them. And thank to you for being here, for participating today. I take the opportunity to wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And please keep following us with the new events that will come in 2019.
Thank you.